My name is Elara Vance, and for 38 years, I was the ghost at my own dinner table. If you grew up in a house where you felt like an uninvited guest, where your successes were met with a polite nod and your failures were catalogued like evidence, then you know the hollow ache I carried. You know the feeling of looking into a mirror and seeing a face that doesn't quite fit the portraits on the hallway wall. I used to think I was just the difficult one. The stubborn child. The daughter who didn't sparkle like my sister, Maya. But this past Thanksgiving, I stopped playing the part. I brought a guest to my mother's house, a man my family spent nearly 4 decades trying to erase from the earth. When he stood up in that crowded dining room and simply stated his name, the world stopped spinning. My mother, Evelyn, was mid-pour, her favorite vintage crystal tilted over a glass. She didn't just gasp, her hand gave way. The glass hit the mahogany table with a sickening crack, and the wine didn't just spill, it bled. It bloomed across the white heirloom lace, a deep crimson reaching toward the silver platters. 20 relatives sat frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, as the silence became a physical weight. My stepfather, Silas, didn't look at the stranger. He leaned toward me, his face the color of ash, and whispered 4 words that shattered the last 30 years of my life. How did you find him? Not, who is this? Not, what is happening? He said how. Because he had always known who. What I discovered in the weeks leading up to that dinner didn't just explain the coldness or the way I was always relegated to the folding plastic table in the drafty hallway while Maya sat at the head of the oak. It explained why my mother flinched every time a stranger told me I had striking eyes that didn't match the Vance blue. It explained why, despite being a senior financial controller who had bailed this family out of 3 separate bad investments, I was still treated like a liability. Before I peel back the layers of this lie, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever been the black sheep, the one who carried the weight but never got the credit, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm reading every single one, because for the first time in my life, I'm finally ready to be heard. To understand the explosion at the table, you have to understand the Vance legacy. My mother, Evelyn, is a woman of curated perfections. In our suburb of Oak Ridge, she is the architect of social standing. Every Thanksgiving for 30 years followed a script written in stone. I would drive 2 hours from the city, arriving early because that was my job. I wasn't the guest. I was the staff. I was the one who hauled the extra folding chairs from the damp garage. I was the one who polished the silver until my thumbs ached. I was the one who wiped down the 14 heavy oak chairs in the main dining room. Chairs I was never allowed to sit in. Elara, honey, you're in the hallway again this year, my mother would say, not looking up from her centerpiece. With the nieces and nephews. You're so much better with the kids, and frankly, there just isn't room at the main table. There was always room for Maya's husband's second cousins. There was always room for Silas's business associates. But for me, the 38-year-old daughter, there was a plastic folding table wedged between the coat rack and the basement door. I spent my life listening to the muffled laughter and the clinking of real glassware from 10 feet away, while I cut up turkey for 6-year-olds and pretended the draft from the door didn't make my teeth chatter. Last year was the breaking point, though I didn't know it then. I was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a stained sponge, watching Silas stand for the annual toast. He gripped the back of his chair, looking at Maya like she was the sun itself. To Maya, he had said, his voice thick with pride. My one true success. My real flesh and blood. The room erupted in here's, but I felt a sudden, sharp coldness. Real flesh and blood, it's a figure of speech, right? People say it all the time. But Silas said it like a legal verdict. He said it while looking directly past me, as if I were a shadow on the wall he'd been trying to paint over for years. I drove home that night in a daze, the phrase looping in my mind. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that being the difficult daughter for 3 decades had made me paranoid. I almost convinced myself to let it go. But the universe has a way of forcing the truth into the light when you're too afraid to look for it yourself. It started with a fluttering in my chest, a skipped beat that I couldn't ignore, and a routine appointment that would change my DNA before the week was out. The doctor's office was sterile and bright, a sharp contrast to the heavy, curtained rooms of my childhood. Dr. Eris was clicking through my charts, his brow furrowed in that way that makes your stomach drop. Elara, your EKG showed a specific arrhythmia. It's often linked to a hereditary condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We need to look at your family history. Do any of your parents or grandparents have a history of heart failure? I laughed, a small, nervous sound. My family doesn't have health problems, doctor. We have Vance vitality. My mother insists on it. But that evening, when I called my mother to ask for the records, that vitality turned into a wall of stone. Mom, the doctor is asking about Dad's side. Did Silas's father have heart issues? There was a silence on the other end of the line, a holding your breath silence. We don't have those problems, Elara, she said, her voice dropping an octave. You're just worked up. You always create drama out of nothing. It's exhausting. I tried to push back, to explain the medical necessity, but she snapped. I said don't worry about it. Silas is perfectly healthy. Focus on your work and stop looking for things to complain about. Click. She hung up on me over a medical question. She chose a lie over my health. The next morning, I was sitting in the break room at work when my colleague, Sarah, sat down across from me. Sarah didn't believe in polite silence. Take a DNA test, she said, her voice flat and certain. If your mother won't give you the history, the science will. It'll flag the health markers, and you'll get the family tree she's clearly trying to prune. I ordered the kit that afternoon. I swabbed my cheek in the bathroom of my apartment, feeling like a traitor. I mailed it off and went back to my spreadsheets, trying to bury the feeling that I was about to set my entire world on fire. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my car in the office parking lot. My phone buzzed. Your DNA results are ready. My heart hammered against my ribs, that same irregular, skipping beat. I logged in and scrolled past the ethnicity estimates. I went straight to family matches. I expected to see Silas's sister. I expected to see the Vance cousins from Chicago. Instead, the top of the list was a name I had never heard in my life. * Julian Thorne. Relationship, parent/child, * my breath hitched. I scrolled down. There were no Vances. Not a single 1% match to the man who had raised me. I sat there until the sun began to set, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, staring at the name of a stranger who owned half of my blood. Then, I did what I always do when I'm backed into a corner. I started to dig. I found an old address for a Julian Thorne in a small town 3 hours away. As I looked at the satellite view of a modest house with a woodworking shop in the back, I realized the heart condition wasn't the only thing my mother had been hiding. I realized the difficult daughter hadn't been born, she had been manufactured to hide a truth that was currently staring back at me from a screen. I put the car in gear, my hands shaking on the wheel, and I started driving toward the one person who might be able to tell me who I actually was. But as I pulled out of the lot, I saw a familiar car idling at the exit, a dark sedan that looked exactly like my mother's. I didn't stop to see if it was really her. I didn't want to know if my mother was already tracking my movements, sensing the shift in the air like an animal senses a storm. I just drove. The highway lights blurred into long, golden needles as I pushed toward the state line, leaving the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge behind. My phone sat in the cup holder. A glowing brick of radioactive truth. 1% match. 0 connection to Silas Vance. And at the very top, mocking 38 years of birthday cards and family portraits, Julian Thorne. Parent. The deeper I drove into the rural heart of Oregon, the more the world began to change. The towering glass office buildings gave way to skeletal trees and mist-shrouded valleys. I was looking for a ghost. I spent the 3-hour drive rehearsing a script I knew I'd forget the second I saw him. * Hi, I think you're my father. Hi, my mother is Evelyn Vance, do you remember her? Hi, why didn't you want me? Each version felt like a jagged piece of glass in my throat. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway of a small, weathered ranch house on the edge of a cedar forest, my hands were cramped tight around the steering wheel. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh-cut wood. There was a light on in a detached garage, a warm, amber glow spilling out onto the wet pavement. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots like breaking bone. My heart did that skip beat again, a flutter of hereditary rebellion. I walked toward the garage, the scent of cedar and linseed oil growing stronger with every step. Inside, a man was hunched over a workbench, his back to me. He wore a faded flannel shirt, his hair a shock of silver against the dark wood of the shop. He was steadying a hand plane, the long, thin curls of wood falling away from his blade like parchment. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, unable to find my voice. Then, he stopped. He didn't turn around immediately, he just held the plane still, listening to the rhythm of the woods. "You've got the same stride as your grandmother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in my chest. He turned slowly, brushing sawdust from his calloused palms. When his eyes met mine, the air left my lungs. They weren't the Vance blue. They weren't my mother's piercing green. They were hazel, flecked with gold and amber. They were my eyes. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask why a stranger was standing in his shop at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. He just stood there, his jaw working, a lifetime of unanswered questions visible in the lines around his mouth. "Elara," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. 38 years of being told I was difficult, 38 years of feeling like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong box, and this man knew my name before I could even introduce myself. He walked toward me, his gait slightly uneven, and I realized with a jolt of terror that I wasn't just looking at a biological match. I was looking at the origin of my own story. As he reached out a hand, then hesitated, I saw something else. On the workbench behind him sat a small, hand-carved wooden box. It was walnut, dark and polished, and the lid was carved with a single, delicate wildflower, the same wildflower I had drawn in the margins of my notebook since I was 6 years old. Julian didn't invite me into the house at first. We stayed in the shop, surrounded by the ghosts of things he'd built. He moved to the corner and pulled a tarp off an old, dusty trunk. "I knew you'd come," he said, not looking at me. "I didn't know when, but I knew those eyes wouldn't let you rest until you found the truth." He sat down on a stool and gestured for me to take the other. The silence between us was heavy. "She told me you didn't want me," I said, the words coming out as a jagged whisper. "She told everyone that you walked away. Silas, he's the only father I've ever known. He's the one who gave me his name. He's the one who let me sit at the table." Julian's face hardened. He reached for the wooden box on the bench and set it between us. "I married your mother in June of 1986, Julian began. We lived in a little apartment over the bakery in town. I was a junior carpenter, she was a girl with big dreams and a mother who hated the smell of sawdust on her daughter's clothes. When you were born, the world finally made sense to me. I held you for 4 hours in that hospital room, Elara. I promised you the world. But Evelyn, she wanted a different world. She wanted the Vance world." He opened the lid. Inside was a stack of Christmas cards, their envelopes yellowed with age. There were photographs, too, blurry shots of a baby with dark hair, a toddler taking her first steps. Then, he pulled out a tattered Polaroid. It was me, barely 3 years old, sitting on his lap. We were both laughing. On the back, in my mother's unmistakable, sharp cursive, it said, E&J, Summer '88, what happened? I asked. Julian closed his eyes. Silas Vance happened. He was the man her parents wanted. He had the money, the lineage, the business. When you were 4, your mother told me she wanted a divorce. I fought her, Elara. I spent every cent I had on lawyers. But a carpenter with no steady contract didn't stand a chance against a man like Silas Vance. They didn't just take you. They erased me. They told the court I was unstable. And then, they moved. They changed their names. They vanished into the suburbs, and they told you I was a ghost. He reached into the trunk and pulled out a manila envelope. I never stopped trying to find you. I sent letters to every address I could find. I sent birthday cards every single year. He handed me a stack of envelopes. My heart stopped. Every single one of them had a red stamp across the front, returned to sender, and below that, in the same sharp cursive I'd seen on 1,000 grocery lists, my mother had written. Asterisk no such person at this address. Do not contact again, asterisk 30 years of birthday cards I never got to open, all because one woman decided a carpenter didn't fit her, curated perfection. I felt a rage beginning to boil in my blood. I wasn't the difficult daughter. I was the stolen one. I stayed in that small town for 3 days, filling in the gaps of 38 years. Julian told me about my grandmother, Vivian. She died 8 years ago, Julian said softly. Her last words were a question. She asked me if I'd found you yet. She wanted to give you her wedding ring. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band with a tiny diamond. It was modest, but it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It was a piece of my history, a real piece, not a borrowed one. As I put it on, I looked at Julian. I'm going back, I said. It's Thanksgiving in 2 weeks. My mother is already telling the family I'm having a mental episode because of my heart condition. She's trying to bury me again. Julian's knuckles turned white as he gripped the workbench. Evelyn will destroy you, Elara. You bring me there, and you lose them all. You lose Silas, you lose Maya, you lose the Vance name. Are you sure you're ready for the fallout? They've already destroyed me, Julian, I said, my voice cold and hard. I'm just the only one who realized it yet. I walked to my car, the manila envelope tucked under my arm like a weapon. But as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed. A message from Maya, asterisk mom says you're spiraling. Don't come to Thanksgiving, Elara. You're going to embarrass us. Just stay away until you're normal again, asterisk I stared at the screen, a dark smile spreading across my face. I didn't reply. I just started the engine. I had 2 weeks to plan, and for the first time in 38 years, I wasn't following the Vance script. I was writing my own. As I drove away, I noticed a black SUV parked at the end of the road, its headlights off. It didn't move until I passed, and then it turned slowly, following me back toward the highway. I wasn't just being tracked anymore. I was being hunted. The weight of that manila envelope on my passenger seat felt heavier than the car itself as I crossed the state line back into Oak Ridge. Julian had stood in his driveway until my taillights faded into the mist. A man who had spent 30 years as a ghost and was now being asked to haunt a dinner party. I kept glancing at the wooden box he'd insisted I take. Inside weren't just cards, they were a roadmap of a father's grief. I pulled over at a rest stop 2 hours outside the city, the neon hum of the vending machines the only sound in the damp night. I opened the box and pulled out a card from 1994. I would have been 6. Inside, in a hand that was younger and steadier than, Julian had written. Asterisk, happy birthday, little bird. I built you a birdhouse today. I painted it blue like your favorite dress. I hope you're looking at the same moon I am tonight. I'm not going anywhere. Asterisk I traced the words, my throat tight. In 1994, I was being told I was difficult, because I wouldn't stop crying for a father I couldn't remember. My mother had told the child psychologist that I was prone to histrionics. She had sat me down in her marble-countered kitchen and told me my real father had found a better family, and that I should be grateful Silas was willing to put up with my moods. Every return to sender stamp in this box was a physical blow to that lie. She hadn't just stolen a father, she had stolen my reality. She had erased my very existence to the one person who wanted me. I didn't just feel anger anymore, I felt a surgical clarity. The heart murmur the doctor found wasn't just a medical condition, it was the physical manifestation of a life built on a hollow foundation. I tucked the cards back into the walnut box, my jaw set. I wasn't just going to show up to Thanksgiving. I was going to dismantle the fortress, brick by lying brick. The preemptive strike came on Monday, 3 days before the holiday. I was in my office when my phone buzzed. It was a call from Evelyn. I let it ring 5 times before I answered. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Elara, her voice came through, sharp as a diamond-tipped drill. I've heard from the neighbors in Dayton. I know you've been trespassing, honey. I know you've been talking to people who aren't well. I leaned back in my chair, staring at a photo of me and Maya. I looked like a stranger in my own life. Trespassing, Mom? It's public property. And Julian seems perfectly well. He remembers you quite clearly. He even has our wedding photos. The silence on the other end was absolute. I could almost hear her calculating. He is a dangerous, unstable man, Elara. Why do you think I had to protect you? You are playing with fire, and you are going to burn down everything we've built for you. If you bring this filth into our lives, you are dead to this family. You will be erased. I felt a shiver, but it wasn't fear. It was recognition. You will be erased. She had been doing it for 38 years. I've already been erased, Mom, I said, my voice as cold as the Oregon mist. I've been sitting at a plastic table in a hallway for 30 years. You can't threaten a ghost with disappearance. I hung up. Half an hour later, my access to the family's joint investment portal was revoked. My mother didn't just want to silence me, she wanted to starve me out. But she forgot one thing: I was the one who had been managing the Vance books for a decade. I knew where every skeleton was buried. The betrayal, however, didn't come from my mother. On Tuesday night, Maya burst into my apartment using her emergency key. What are you doing, Elara? Mom is hysterical. She says you're trying to blackmail her with some carpenter. I watched my sister, the golden child, tremble with indignation. It's not blackmail, Maya. It's the truth. Silas isn't my father. Julian Thorne is. Maya laughed, a brittle sound that set my teeth on edge. So what? Even if it's true, so what? Silas gave us everything. The house, the cars, the name. Do you have any idea how hard Mom has worked to keep our family looking perfect? I looked at Maya and realized she didn't care about the truth. She cared about the veneer. She didn't work to keep us perfect, Maya. She worked to keep me small. She sat me at that kid's table so she wouldn't have to look at Julian's eyes every time she took a bite of turkey. Maya stepped toward me, her voice dropping to a hiss. If you show up on Thursday with that man, I will tell everyone you've had a breakdown. I'll tell them the heart condition has gone to your head. You're the difficult one, Elara. Everyone already believes it. Who are they going to listen to? The senior financial controller who's spiraling, or the perfect daughter trying to save her mother? She slammed the door so hard the frames rattled. I sat on the kitchen floor, the silence rushing back in. I was alone. My sister had the narrative, my mother had the resources, and Silas was the silent judge. Most people would have backed down. But as I sat there, I felt a steady pulse in my chest, not a skipped beat, but a strong, rhythmic thrum. I reached for my phone and dialed Julian. I'm coming to get you, I said. Wear the sports jacket we picked out. It's time to go to dinner. The drive back to Oak Ridge on Thanksgiving morning was monochromatic gray. Julian sat in the passenger seat, his hands folded over the walnut box. Are you sure about this, Elara? He asked. Once we walk through that door, there's no going back. You're choosing a man you barely know over the life you've built. I looked at the massive colonial house at the end of the cul-de-sac. It looked like a postcard. It looked like a lie. I haven't built a life there, Julian. I've been a tenant in a museum of my mother's making. I'm not choosing you over them. I'm choosing myself. I saw the shadows of relatives moving behind the heavy drapes. Aunt Margaret, cousin Kevin, Maya's husband Brett. They were all there, gathered around the hearth of a counterfeit history. I tucked the manila envelope under my arm, took a deep breath, and opened the car door. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I just turned the handle on the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer. The house was loud, the clink of crystal, the sound of music, the laughter of children. And then, as we stepped into the light of the great room, the sound evaporated. My mother was standing by the sideboard, a bottle of wine in her hand. She turned, her hostess smile pinned in place, and then she saw us. The smile shattered. The bottle slipped from her fingers, hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. The wine didn't just spill, it sprayed, a dark arc splattering across her white silk dress. "How did you find him?" Silas's voice came from the head of the table, a low growl that silenced the room. "I didn't go to the hallway. I didn't look for the plastic table. I walked straight to the head of the oak, pulled out the empty chair next to Silas, and sat down. Julian stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder. "Happy Thanksgiving, Silas," I said, my voice echoing in the absolute silence. "I think it's time we talked about real blood." The front door hadn't even clicked shut before the atmosphere in the foyer curdled. It was that specific, heavy silence that precedes a natural disaster. The pull of the tide before the tsunami hits. I stood there, Julian's steady breathing at my shoulder, watching the Vance legacy dissolve in real time. The house smelled of rosemary, expensive butter, and the metallic tang of the red wine now soaking into my mother's cream rug. Evelyn didn't move. She looked like a statue carved from salt, her eyes locked on Julian with a terror so raw it felt indecent to witness. Silas, however, was a different story. He didn't rise from his chair at the head of the table. He leaned forward, the carving knife still in his hand, his knuckles white against the handle. "How did you find him?" he repeated, his voice dropping into a register I'd only heard when he was destroying a competitor. He didn't ask who Julian was. He didn't demand to know why a stranger was in his home. That one word, how was the final confession. I didn't answer him. Not yet. I walked deeper into the room, the heels of my boots clicking against the hardwood with military precision. I could see the relatives, Aunt Margaret, Cousin Kevin, all paralyzed. Maya was standing near the fireplace, her face a mask of horrified fury, her hand gripping the mantel so hard I thought the marble might crack. I reached the archway of the dining room, where the light from the chandelier hit the polished oak. There were 14 chairs. 13 were occupied by people who shared the Vance name, the Vance money, or the Vance lies. One chair, at the very end near the window, sat empty. I walked straight to it. I didn't look at the plastic folding table in the shadows of the hallway. I pulled the oak chair back, the heavy wood groaning against the floor, and I sat down. Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He followed me, his presence a jarring intrusion of flannel and sawdust in a room full of silk and cashmere. He pulled the 14th chair and placed it right next to mine. He sat with the posture of a man who had spent 40 years building things that lasted. He placed the walnut box on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the silver gravy boat. The wildflower carving on the lid seemed to glow under the lights. My mother finally found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Elara, get up. Take this man and leave. You are having a medical crisis. We all know about the heart condition. We know you aren't yourself." She looked around the table, her eyes pleading with the relatives to join the gaslighting. "She's spiraling, everyone. Please, don't listen to her. Silas, tell her to leave." But Silas was staring at Julian's hands, the calloused, scarred hands of a carpenter. He knew he couldn't talk his way out of this. The resemblance between Julian and me was no longer a subtle suggestion. In this light, sitting side by side, it was a shouting match. The uninvited guest wasn't just Julian. It was the truth itself, pulling up a chair and demanding to be fed. I looked at Maya, who was now moving toward the table, her voice a sharp hiss. "This is a joke, right? You brought a drifter to Thanksgiving to spite Mom? To ruin my first holiday as a married woman?" I looked at my sister, the golden child, and for the first time, I didn't feel the old sting of jealousy. I felt pity. She was fighting for a kingdom made of cardboard. "He isn't a drifter, Maya," I said. "He's the man who held me for 4 hours the day I was born. He's the man whose letters Mom spent 30 years returning to sender. He's my father." A collective gasp rippled around the table, but I didn't look away from Silas. I waited for the patriarch to speak. Instead, he just sat there, the carving knife still gripped in his hand, watching the red wine stain on the rug spread like a dark omen. The silence that followed was a living thing. Silas finally set the carving knife down with a dissonant clang. He didn't look at me, He looked at Evelyn. You told me he died, he said, his voice a low vibration. You told me the divorce was final and the man was gone. You told me the records were sealed. My mother's face went from salt white to a mottled red. I did it for us, Silas. I did it for the family. Look at what we have. Look at what she would have been if I'd stayed with a woodworker in a shed. She turned to me, her eyes flaring with desperate light. You think this is better? You think having him is worth losing everything else? You're a Vance, Elara. You have the name. You have the inheritance. I have a heart condition, Mom, I said, my voice steady, cutting through her hysteria. A hereditary one that you lied about for 3 decades. You were willing to let me die of a treatable arrhythmia just to keep your secret safe. You didn't protect me. You protected the brand. I reached for the walnut box and flipped the latch. The click was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I pulled out the first stack of letters, the ones from the early 90s with the tiny drawings of birds and swing sets. I didn't hand them to her. I fanned them out on the tablecloth. The red, "Return to Sender," stamp stood out against the white linen like fresh wounds. 30 years of cards, Mom. 30 years of a father trying to find his daughter, and you wrote, "No such person," on every single one. You didn't just hide him. You denied I even existed. Maya reached across the table, her fingers trembling as she picked up an envelope. She recognized the handwriting. She looked at the date, July 1998. The year I was 10. The year I was told my father had started a better family and didn't want to hear from me ever again. Maya looked at our mother, her confidence beginning to crumble. Mom? Is this really yours? Evelyn didn't answer. She slumped into her chair, looking for the first time like an old woman. The fortress hadn't just been breached, it had been hollowed out. Julian finally spoke, his voice calm and anchored. I didn't come for the money, Silas. I didn't come to ruin your dinner. I came because my daughter asked me to. And because I'm tired of being the only one who remembers the truth. The room shifted then. The relatives, the ones who had spent 30 years nodding along to the difficult Elara narrative, were looking at the letters. Aunt Margaret, my mother's own sister, stood up and walked around the table. She picked up a photo of Julian's mother, Vivian. She looked at the photo, then at me, then back at the photo. Her hand went to her mouth. Oh, Evelyn, she whispered. She's the image of Vivian. We all saw it. We all said she didn't look like a Vance, and you told us we were crazy. Silas stood up then. He looked diminished. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than disappointment in his eyes. I saw fear. You think this changes anything, Elara? You're still my daughter in the eyes of the law. I'm the one who paid for the schools. You think a box of old letters makes him your father? I stood up to meet him. I felt the ring, Vivian's ring, cool and solid against my finger. You provided the roof, Silas. But you made sure I knew I was a guest under it. You sat me in the hallway. You made toasts to real blood while I was standing in the kitchen with a sponge. You didn't raise a daughter. You maintained an asset. I turned to the rest of the table. The dinner is over, I said. I'm not sitting at the plastic table anymore. And I'm not sitting at this one either. Because a table built on a lie is just a pile of expensive wood. I looked at Julian, and he stood with me, his hand finding mine. We didn't wait for a rebuttal. We turned and walked out, past the ruined rug and the shattered crystal, leaving the Vance legacy to choke on its own silence. As we hit the cold November air, I heard Maya's voice behind us, thin and breaking, calling my name. But for the first time in 38 years, I didn't turn back. I wasn't the ghost anymore. They were. I laid the manila envelope open on the white linen, fanning out the contents like a daughter reclaiming the scattered debris of a life. The silence was so absolute I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that usually signaled the steady passage of Vance time, but now sounded like a countdown to an explosion. There, between the silver gravy boat and the untouched sweet potatoes, lay the DNA results. A clinical printout that stripped Silas of his title with cold precision. 0%, no genetic connection to the Vance line. And right beside it, the first-degree match to Julian Thorne. But the paper wasn't the heart of it. The heart was the photograph. I placed it in the center of the table. It was me at 3 years old, sitting on Julian's lap in that sun-drenched yard in Oregon. On the back, my mother's handwriting was as undeniable as a fingerprint, *E&J, Easter 88. I watched the eyes of my relatives move from the photo to my mother, then to Julian, then finally to me. The recognition was a physical wave. Aunt Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the edge of the photo. She looked at the image of Julian's mother, Vivian, the woman with the high cheekbones and the determined jaw. My jaw. My cheekbones. She looks just like you, Elara, Margaret whispered. We all saw it for years. We joked that you were a throwback. But you aren't a throwback. You're a thorn. She looked at my mother. Evelyn, how could you? How could you sit here every year and watch her eat in the hallway, knowing he was out there looking for her? Silas broke first. He shoved his chair back, the heavy oak legs screaming against the hardwood floor. He stood over me, his face a terrifying shade of purple. Get out, he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. Get out of my house. You are a ghost from a life that doesn't exist anymore. Julian didn't flinch. He just looked at Silas with a quiet patience. I didn't come for your house, Silas, Julian said. And I didn't come for your money. I came because my daughter invited me. I'll leave when she's ready, and not a second before. Silas turned his fury on me. I raised you. I paid for the elite schools, the vacations, the life you've enjoyed. I am your father by every metric that matters. I stood up to match him, the gold band of Vivian's ring catching the light. You provided the infrastructure, Silas. But you never provided the home. You used me as a living penance for my mother's mistake. You sat me at the children's table until I was nearly 40 so you wouldn't have to look at the face of the man you replaced. You didn't raise a daughter, you maintained a secret. And the price of that secret was my identity. I looked around the room at the cousins, the aunts, the uncles. The Vance legacy is a fiction. And I'm finished playing the lead role. I gave Julian a small nod. We didn't wait for a rebuttal. We walked out of the dining room, our footsteps echoing in the stunned silence of 20 people who had just realized they were dining on a graveyard. We hit the cold November air, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a draft. It felt like oxygen. The fallout happened in waves. By Monday morning, the Vance narrative was hemorrhaging. Aunt Margaret was the first to call. She didn't ask for my mother, she asked for Julian's address. I remember him now, Elara, she told me. I let myself believe the stories because it was easier than facing what Evelyn had done. I won't do it anymore. The younger cousins, the ones I'd spent 30 years cutting turkey for, sent messages of support. They had seen the return to sender letters, and they weren't going back to the old script. My mother chose a different path. She sent a 3-page email from an address I didn't recognize. It was a masterpiece of deflection, asterisk, I did it to protect you. You have destroyed a family for a whim of curiosity. Asterisk, I read it once, then deleted it. The wine stain on her rug was never coming out, and neither was the truth. The most unexpected shift came from Maya. 2 weeks later, we sat in a quiet coffee shop. Silas is losing it, Elara, she whispered. He told me if I keep talking to you, I'm out of the will. He's trying to make me choose. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the sister I might have had. I told him he couldn't buy my silence anymore. I'm going to Dayton this weekend. I want to meet Julian. We weren't the golden child and the outsider anymore. We were just two sisters trying to find ground that wasn't a trapdoor. The highway to Dayton became my regular commute. I traded the glass-walled office for the smell of cedar shavings and the rhythmic sound of a hand plane. Julian set up a second workbench for me. He taught me to read the grain, to understand that if you fight the wood, it splinters, but if you work with it, you find the strength hidden inside. One Saturday, we stood at Vivian's grave. I laid chrysanthemums at the base. I found him, I whispered. Standing there, with my father on one side and my grandmother's spirit on the other, I felt a sense of gravity I had never known. I wasn't floating in the hallway of someone else's house anymore. I was rooted. I'm not telling you this to suggest every truth ends in a perfect sunset. The Vance house is still there, inhabited by two people being eaten alive by the silence they created. I lost a name and an inheritance, but I gained a pulse. I gained a heart that finally knows who it's beating for. I spent 4 decades trying to earn a seat at a table that was rigged against me. But acceptance isn't a transaction. If the table you're sitting at requires you to erase your history to be comfortable, it's not your table. You don't have to wait for a crumb of acknowledgement. You have the right to look the lie in the eye and say, no more. And if they won't make room for you? Then walk into the workshop and build your own. Julian handed me a card last week for my 39th birthday, the first one I'll celebrate as Elara Thorne. Inside, he wrote, to my little bird. You aren't a ghost anymore. I'm so proud to be your father. I didn't cry. I just put the card in the wooden box and went back to work. The pen is finally in my hand. For the first time in 40 years, I'm the one writing the story. So, I have one final question for you. If you were me, and that phone rang tomorrow with a voicemail from the mother who spent 30 years erasing you, would you call her back, or would you let the silence speak for itself? Type call or wait in the comments. I'm reading every single one. And if you're sitting at your own children's table tonight, remember this, the door isn't locked. You just have to be brave enough to turn the handle. I'll see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.